He's an athlete, he's a competitor, he's a fighter. You
What?
know, he's this, that. Baker Mayfield. That isn't that's not what Baker Mayfield's known for. The guy. This is the guy IQ down there in Tampa.
It is officially accountability time from your boy. As a man that has made so much content on Baker Mayfield over the past year and all the mistakes that he's made, which by the way, they're still mistakes, it's with great pleasure I bring you a video of his redemption. I mean, it's been enough games. It's been 10 games of the NFL season so far, and nobody is talking about this. It's almost as if they're waiting for something negative to happen to discuss Baker Mayfield. Not on this channel. Before we get to the content, make sure you drop like, subscribe, and turn on our notifications to help the channel grow. Now that we get all that out of the way, break! Leading up to the season, I spammed predictions at you guys consistently. Michael Porter Jr. needed over 5.5 rebounds in his season debut. Tyreek Hill just needed a touchdown, and Steph Curry just needed 1 point. Shout out to those that tailed. For those of you guys that were able to make money, we're giving away our picks for free all season long for the NBA and NFL on my Instagram at @TheFlightMike. And right now, when you use promo code Mikerophone on Prize Picks, they'll match your deposit up until $100. Thank you, Prize Picks, for the sponsor. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? From the moment that Baker Mayfield was selected with the #1 overall pick in the 2018 NFL draft, it was met with some controversy. At the time, many were looking at the Cleveland Browns to figure out who was going to be the next quarterback that they're going to select and set up for failure. Who was going to be their next big QB bust? Many people thought it was either going to be Sam Darnold or Josh Allen, and the entire world wasn't expecting Baker Mayfield. I remember looking at mock drafts at the time and seeing Baker Mayfield going number 11 to the Miami Dolphins. So when he was selected #1 overall, for me that was a huge shock, but I also understood why he was selected #1 overall. This was an organization that has been losing for way too long. They didn't trust themselves to develop a player like Sam Darnold or Josh Allen, so they went with the prospect that they believed had the highest chance to succeed and was the safest pick, which, looking back at it, thinking that Baker Mayfield is the safest pick is comical initially, but again, you have to understand, this is a quarterback draft that featured Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, who was considered to be a little bit of a project because he was very, very turnover prone in USC and still is turnover prone to this day. Josh Allen, who possessed prototypical quarterback size, but pretty much was looked at as a potential Blake Bortles or Blaine Gabbert prospect if the right team didn't have the opportunity to develop him. Josh Rosen, who was considered to be the most pro-ready prospect out of everyone in that draft, but there were some questions about his motivation and his character.
Absolutely the best quarterback in the draft, by far. I want to go to the team that wants me the most. I want to win Super Bowls, and I want to have the most. So I'm coming for Tom Brady's record, and I plan on getting picked pretty early.
And Lamar Jackson, who also won a Heisman, but at the same time, there are questions about whether or not he could be a NFL quarterback. The Cleveland Browns would select Baker Mayfield with the #1 overall pick, and he would eventually become their greatest quarterback in franchise history since returning to Cleveland, meaning since the expansion Browns came into town in 1999 and selected Tim Couch, not the years preceding that. In year 1, Baker Mayfield would finish runner-up to Rookie of the Year, and this is where the legend of Baker Mayfield would begin. It is one of the most inconsistent careers that I think I've ever seen, and the interesting thing about inconsistency is typically front offices are trying to figure out why that inconsistency is there to begin with. What do I mean by that? Well, in year 1, Baker Mayfield played in 13 games, threw 27 touchdowns and 14 interceptions, completed 64% of his passes, and finished runner-up for Rookie of the Year. Future was looking bright for Baker Mayfield, but he was doing this underneath an interim head coach, Greg Williams. Yes, that Greg Williams. So the Cleveland Browns understood that they found their quarterback of the future, and they wanted to go all in on him. And they wanted to make sure that they didn't mess up the chemistry that they had last year. So when they asked Baker Mayfield who they should hire as the next head coach, he said this.
Everything that he stood for last year, when he was the interim offensive coordinator, was about being up front, holding each other accountable, working hard, working for us, being just upfront about everything. I think just to set the tone with everybody.
So when the Browns asked Baker Mayfield who should be their next head coach, he endorsed Freddie Kitchens. Not only that, but the Cleveland Browns also found a wide receiver one for Baker, swinging a huge trade where they gave up the number 17 overall pick and a third-round pick, in addition to Kevin Zeitler and Jabril Peppers, for Olivier Vernon and Odell Beckham Jr. A huge trade that brought in 2 stars on both sides of the ball and reunited Baker Mayfield with his childhood friend Jarvis Landry. And the result was disastrous to say the least. Baker Mayfield would only win 6 games, would lose 10 of them, would throw 22 touchdowns to 21 interceptions, wouldn't even complete 60% of his completions. And once again, there are questions surrounding Baker Mayfield and his ability to potentially be the quarterback of the Browns for the foreseeable future. Enter Kevin Stefanski, who might be the greatest hire that the Cleveland Browns have had since returning to Cleveland in 1999. Bear in mind, I always like to differentiate between these two eras because the pre-1999 Cleveland Browns, before they moved to Baltimore, were one of the best teams in NFL history and had some really good moments. It just seems like ever since this expansion team returned, things have been a little bit different. The Kevin Stefanski era started off remarkably. In Baker's first year with Kevin Stefanski, he threw for 26 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, completed 63% of his passes, had the best record of his career, 11-5, and led the Cleveland Browns to a victory over the Pittsburgh Steelers, which had to have been satisfying. Yes, I know it was primarily the Cleveland Browns defense that was getting the job done, but that's not much different from today's Cleveland Browns. But in 2021, things would get really, really bad for Baker Mayfield. And this is a very polarizing season because on one hand, people would blame this down year due to injury and some distractions. On the other, people just thought Baker Mayfield sucked. But year 4 was very significant because this is the year that the Cleveland Browns needed to make a decision on Baker. So far, they had 2 good seasons and 1 bad season from Baker Mayfield, and he was consistently flip-flopping from good season to bad season to good season to bad season. And you can make legitimate arguments as to why those seasons were bad, but at the end of the day, you needed to decide whether or not Baker Mayfield was going to be the Cleveland Browns franchise QB. And while I guess you could say the theme for the next year and a half of Baker Mayfield's career was self-sabotage, because Baker Mayfield would sustain a shoulder injury in the earlier part of the season. But in typical Baker Mayfield fashion, to show off how tough he is, he decided to play through that shoulder injury. This resulted in some drama. He was missing a wide open Odell Beckham Jr. down the field, which OBJ's father made sure all of social media found out and called him out, which would eventually result in OBJ getting released, not even traded. Cleveland Browns would have a down season, not even making it to the playoffs. And Baker Mayfield's 2021 somewhat resembled his sophomore season, throwing 17 touchdowns to 13 interceptions, just over 3,000 passing yards, and not making it to the playoffs. And when Deshaun Watson became available, the Cleveland Browns began flirting with him immediately, resulting in this heartfelt letter that Baker Mayfield penned to Cleveland because he knew that his time was up. The craziest part about this is Deshaun Watson initially didn't want to go to Cleveland, but Cleveland was willing to pay him a fully guaranteed contract just to ensure that Deshaun Watson would join the Cleveland Browns. That's how desperately they wanted him. This is something that Baker said really hurted him.
I feel disrespected 100%. Because I was told one thing and they completed another.
But I also have been critical of Baker Mayfield for not just staying on the Browns through this entire situation. Instead of sitting back and waiting out Deshaun Watson's 12-game suspension and filling in for Deshaun Watson during those 12 games with a brand new souped-up supporting cast featuring Amari Cooper, playing in a system that he was already very familiar with, and proving to everyone that the reason why he performed so poorly the year prior was because of a shoulder injury, Baker decided to demand a trade almost immediately. And he got his wish. He got traded to the Panthers, who were a dumpster fire in their own right. He got traded there in the middle of July. He didn't really have that much time to learn the new playbook. And then once Baker Mayfield got the opportunity to start, he performed horribly, throwing 6 interceptions, 6 touchdowns, completing 57.8% of his passes. His head coach got fired in the middle of all this, and he would get cut from the Panthers. Luckily for Baker Mayfield, the Rams gave him a lifeline, and he performed fairly well in the 4 games that he played for them, which gave him his his golden opportunity, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This past offseason, I've said it many times, this was Baker Mayfield's final opportunity. It's customary for a player who happens to be easily the best quarterback of a franchise's previous 2 decades to get paid a huge contract extension. And in the case of Baker Mayfield, he definitely was that for the Cleveland Browns. But instead, he was on his 4th team on a prove-it deal, trying to prove to the NFL that he belonged as a starter. And there was no better situation for him to prove that than to fill in the gigantic shoes that were left by the greatest player of all time, Tom Brady. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers were the perfect scenario for Baker Mayfield to prove that he was a good quarterback. They had one of the best wide receiver cores in the NFL. They still have a very strong defense. Their running game kind of leaves something to be desired. Their offensive line is fairly solid as well. And in the offseason, there were some questions about whether or not he would be able to beat out Kyle Trask to be QB1. Not only did Baker Mayfield go practically flawless in the entire preseason, but he is in the middle of one of his best seasons to date. And I cannot overstate this enough. Overstate? Understate? Whatever. Baker Mayfield so far has played in 9 games for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. In those 9 games, they're 4-5 on the season, but they're still in the thick of the playoff race, only behind the New Orleans Saints by 1 game. I mean, if you look at the entire NFC South, this division looks terrible. I mean, it's actually pretty funny. They almost all have losing records. I honestly don't put the blame on Baker Mayfield. A good example is his last loss came to the Houston Texans, where he actually put together a remarkable drive to give the Tampa Bay Buccaneers a victory. But unfortunately for Baker Mayfield, he was going up against CJ Stroud, who led one of the craziest comebacks that I think I've seen in NFL history. I mean, the throws CJ Stroud was making in that game was just insane. And as a result, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers would lose. Currently, if you look at his per game metrics, against the Tennessee Titans, he was 18 of 29 for 278 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Against the Texans, he was 21 of 30 for 2 touchdowns and no interceptions. He lost to the Buffalo Bills, but he was 25 of 42 for 2 touchdowns and no interceptions. I'd say that his worst loss of the year came to the Detroit Lions, where the Buccaneers lost 6-20, but at the very minimum, Baker Mayfield is keeping the Buccaneers in these games, which is much more than I was expecting. He currently has 14 touchdowns and 5 interceptions on the year, throwing for 2,143 yards. And probably the most remarkable statistic that I've seen so far this year is this comparison between Trevor Lawrence and Baker Mayfield. Now, I know that some people are going to accuse this page of cherry picking stats, but the fact that this is even comparable is remarkable. Trevor Lawrence has 2,120 passing yards, a 9-6 TD to interception ratio, and an 89.3 passer rating to Baker Mayfield's 2,143 passing yards, 14-5 pass TD to interception ratio, and 93.7 pass rating. And I'm not trying to say Trevor Lawrence is bad, I'm just saying Baker Mayfield is a lot better than we gave him credit for. At the end of the day, if he could keep this up, not only would he have a spot in the NFL, but he should have a long-term contract offer from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that maybe mirrors what Geno Smith got from the Seattle Seahawks to be their starting quarterback for the foreseeable future. And if he keeps playing this way, I don't see any reason to not do that. Either way, at least for now, because his career is going to keep going, Baker Mayfield has redeemed himself in an incredible way. Now, could you expect this type of production next year if Mike Evans leaves? I'm not necessarily sure, but for now, Baker Mayfield looks like a solid quarterback. As a matter of fact, one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. Let me know in the comment section down below if you're sold on Baker Mayfield's redemption. Do you think the Tampa Bay Buccaneers should rebuild around him for the foreseeable future? And if you were the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, how much of a contract extension would you give him? Would you give him a 2-year, a 3-year, maybe franchise tag him for a year? I'd like to hear what you have to say. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.